Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perspective Podcast. I'm your host, William Ikemba, and today we have with us special guest, the social entrepreneur, Mrs. Sarah Henry. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, it's good to have you. So tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
About myself. I am a feminist deep in my core, have been in the social justice world for too many decades to count at this point, and have always been fascinated around the intersection of systems change, policy change, and how do you actually empower local activists to be able to solve for, and then what's the role of global participation in local change.
And we are going to start with a more lighthearted question today before we get into our main subjects. So if you could tell me your three favorite artists in that order, who are they?
Oof. Right now, okay, I'm going to go with today's mood because it changes. Right. Beyonce, Macklemore,
yeah,
and The National.
Okay. What's your favorite Beyonce song?
Oh my gosh. I do love Lemonade.
I've been listening to a lot of The National. What era would you say they are?
I would say I loved their like mid 2000s albums.
Yeah.
The early stuff.
Okay. I listened to some 2000s. I like Backstreet Boys. Are they?
Yeah.
They're 2000s, right?
No, gosh. Backstreet Boys. I think I had their pillows when I was in elementary school. So
Okay,
probably, I think it like early 90s, don't you think?
Okay.
I don't know. I'm so bad about time, but yeah.
Okay. So most of the questions I have for you today are going to be debate questions, arguing against someone questions. And so for our first debate question, if you had to argue with somebody who claims that women are not oppressed, how would you argue with them? What would you say?
I mean, first of all, I would just love to hear, I'd love them to start because I would love to hear where you even start with that women aren't oppressed because, I mean, even that as a starting place is a ridiculous place to start. I mean, I think what I would hone in on and where I would focus is where it's come to me in my career working in, particularly in global development, but really in women's rights and reproductive rights, is just that what I have come to is the world wasn't designed for women, particularly different subsets of women, right? Women are not a homogeneous category, right? Yeah. If we really look at it in an intersectional way where we look at caste, religion, race, rural versus, right? Where it's not a homogeneous population. And I think part of it that it's not oppressed is like, which women are we talking about?
Yeah.
And on what issue, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that's really important. And I think a lot of our arguments are just to lump everybody in one bigger thing. And I think my argument would be more of really honing in onto the details. What are we talking about? What issue are we talking about? Which women are we talking about? And then I think really arming myself and in the argument with we know the data. We know whether it's access to education, to freedom of speech, depending on where we are. Women historically, when we do an analysis of the most oppressed, it's usually women. And so I think better understanding when people make that argument, what they're talking about, and then I would say laser focused in dismantling all of with data, kind of that broad general idea.
Okay. So if somebody presented to you this idea that, okay, maybe women were oppressed a while ago, but in 2024 today, women are not oppressed anymore. Like, how specifically would you argue with that? What would you say to them?
I think I'd make it, I think I'd help bring it down to something that we could actually have a conversation about. So if we were to say, women weren't oppressed years ago and now were oppressed years ago and they aren't anymore, I would bring up in the United States, the current issue of reproductive justice, right? To say, women, we don't even have autonomy over our own bodies, whether or not we choose to have children. And in some states in the United States, it doesn't even matter if we were assaulted and raped and became pregnant. I would also say, we don't have rights in the Constitution in the United States. Most Americans don't even understand that. that women do not have equal rights in the Constitution. It's still something that's being fought for. So I think, depending on the level, it's at every level, either policy level, or to even rights to whether or not I can choose to get choices over my own body, depends on where I live and the access I have to resources or health
Yeah.
insurance or not. I just, yeah, like I said, I would love to have that argument, but then I would bring it down to tangible, specific examples. And I think there are lots, unfortunately, still across a range of issues.
Yeah, definitely. It's a great response. Okay, on to our next debate question. Sources have proven that in Africa specifically, there's a lower literacy rate for women in comparison to men. And people believe that women have a lower literacy rate because for many reasons. So, how would you argue against someone who believes that women in Africa have a lower literacy rate because they believe they choose not to work as hard? How would you argue against that?
Ooh, wow. I mean, I think I go back to the data, as you were saying, right? Literacy rates are going up globally everywhere, and particularly around more girls in school. We also know that one of the biggest drivers of achieving gender equality globally is education. And that yes, it's an access issue. It's not a women or girls don't want to be taught or aren't hardworking. It's if you don't have access to a school, you're not enrolled in school. It has nothing to do with that, right?
Yeah.
And I think that we've also shown, right, in the data and evidence, which is really fascinating to me too, when you look at girls and young boys on standardized tests globally, girls are testing higher or if not equivalent with boys across all issue areas.
Yeah.
But we found that cultural norms, by the way in which we have socialized and continue to socialize girls to be caretakers, that it's not as important to their education. Girls start to believe by age 5, even though they're testing higher in math and the sciences than their male peers in many instances, believe that they're not smart in math. So I think, it's this intersection too about societal norms of what we tell girls, access to education, right? And then the support structures to keep girls in school, whether that be through menstrual pad access, whether that be through stipends, whether that be through supporting families, right? Because it's not, in many instances, right, it's an economic choice of what they need to do in order to survive and how they divide labor. And home labor has been shown, or the norm is that that's a girl's job, that's a woman's job. Right. So I think part of it is how we ask the questions, but then also what do we prioritize and what do we value?
So you would say that it's definitely not because they're choosing to be lazy. The choice is kind of taken to be lazy, quote unquote. But the choice is like taken away from them because of, you would say, societal expectations and cultural norms.
Yeah, and also just access,
Yeah.
right? It's not that girls don't want to, it's that they
Yeah.
don't necessarily have access. And even when they have access, don't necessarily have the support, both structurally, policy wise, or within families to really pursue an education because there are other priorities, right?
Yeah.
That are pressures from the family to leave school.
And then something interesting that you touched on that you said that the Constitution didn't include women. Could you like go deeper into that for the audience?
We haven't passed the Equal Rights Amendment in the United
Okay.
States, so it's not codified in the U.S. Constitution that
Yeah.
women have equal rights.
Okay. That's interesting.
It is
So,
really interesting.
because so with that, so by law, like a court could claim that because a woman is like if a judge wanted to, he could claim that because she's a woman is a woman, she doesn't have equal rights. Could a court do that?
Oh my gosh, now you're asking legal questions, and I'm way, way over my skis
Okay,
in
okay,
terms of how it actually plays out.
okay,
But there's the Equal Rights Amendment has not been passed within the United States, just meaning as the constitutional amendment, it has not been
yeah,
passed that women have equal rights.
okay,
And which most Americans don't know.
yeah,
that, you know, we often assume here in the United States that we're doing really well, and we're not. Again, when we actually slice the issue by you know, by economic status, by all of these different indicators, it's not again a one size fits all.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so was the equal rights is that a proposal, or is that what it would be called if it was passed, or has it been brought up and then like put down kind of thing?
The ERA coalition, which is fighting for getting it passed, the Equal Rights Amendment.
Okay, okay, that's cool. That's cool.
Yeah, so if
And so,
anybody's interested in learning more, go to the ERA coalition to learn more about how they're fighting.
thank you for doing that. Thanks for sharing that information. Okay, on to our next debate question. How would you argue against someone who claims that injustices to women, even if they are bad, are part of culture, or part of the way society is, and you shouldn't tamper with it to keep maintain the status quo?
Mm. Again, I'm like, I just want to meet these people that are making these arguments. That it's like, how do you reframe the argument? I think it's
No.
this, you know, the acceptance of violence or discrimination, as it's always been that way, therefore it always will be,
Yeah.
you know, it's just for fundamentally flawed, fundamentally flawed as a both a right, but also just as a human. Just if we look at humanity, just the argument that that essentially by saying that you're saying that someone based on their sex at birth or the gender that they're assigned is less valuable or less worthy
Mhm.
than another human. Again, like I find having that debate, I would love to hear the other side. I would love to hear why,
Right.
or excusing violence against anybody based on anything is okay.
Mhm.
Is like, again, try it's like to argue with myself because I can't even fathom coming up with that
Yeah.
even that side of it. Um, you know, because fundamentally you just have to, if you're making that argument, you fundamentally have to believe that somebody's life and their value is worth less
Mhm.
and that they somehow deserve based on, you know, their sex or their assigned gender is less worthy than somebody else.
Yeah.
And I just don't even know how you have that conversation.
Definitely. Yeah. And so, what would you? I have two final questions. So, what would you put
Yeah.
that kind of belief down to? These kind of beliefs that seem that are, I mean, that are so outrageous. What would you call that? Would that be ignorance, or this be like what would that be?
I mean, hate is learned,
Mhm.
right? And I
Yeah.
think discrimination, bias, all of these things are learned. And I think patriarchy is intersected with all different kinds of things in different cultures and different communities, right? And I think that, you know, part of particularly around personally, I believe personally around women's rights and particularly around girls are all of the cultural norms that we have. Like I was saying, girls are caretakers. We're given dolls. We're not necessarily given Legos to build or cars to ram. We're given baby dolls, caretaking, right? We're from a very young age, there's a very scope of what our roles and responsibilities within society are. And I think part of it potentially is it's also flipping those narratives and beliefs of what's possible. It's role models. It's also like we talked about, it's changing actual policy.
Yeah.
Because these systems are embedded. They're designed to be unequitable. Like I
Yeah.
said, the world wasn't designed for women and girls. It was mostly designed for white privileged men. Therefore, you're outside of that, and the systems have inherent structural inequities within them, right? And
Yeah.
so it's a layered question because it's internal beliefs, it's what you're told, it's seeing role models that don't look like you that are successful.
Yeah.
It's opportunities to go to school and not go to school, but actually thrive in school, right? And it's even, you know, to and that's influenced by what you're absorbing either through media, but mostly through family and through the community with which you live. So I think it's an interesting multi-layered, you know, answer, but also there are lots of different levers within there that there are amazing organizations and individuals that are fighting to bring awareness about. Because I also believe if you can't see something, you can't solve for it.
Yeah.
Right. So there's like this opportunity for light bulb moments in these conversations with people that maybe have a certain belief structure, or you can almost myth bust and say, like, did you know that the US hasn't even codified women's rights within our Constitution?
Yeah.
Right. What? You know, like, let's have a conversation about that. If that's a structural issue, a policy issue, but it's also effects on an individual level. So I think, you know, it's lots of different things, but I think the more awareness, like what you're doing through your podcast, the more nuanced conversations we can have. Which
Yeah.
women, which girls, where, why? We can start to unpack and then see the challenge, and then also build programs and policies that actually get at the fundamental root cause of that injustice versus a band-aid.
Yeah. And so, with obviously like ignorant beliefs passed around like this or questions asked like this, do you think that would you still, from how you sound, would you still say that it is possible to kind of teach the correct or to teach a more ethical way of thinking, or do you think that people will just stay the way they are and it's kind of you have to
Mm.
work around it?
Mm. I mean, entrenched beliefs. I mean, it's fascinating, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I guess I would say that we all, every human, no matter where we are, no matter what our levels of privilege and access are, all have unlearning to do,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
And so there's parts of all of us that need to continue to learn. And part of that to me is I do believe it's possible. I wouldn't be doing this work if I didn't think it was possible.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I'm encouraged by the current conversations that are happening, and also really challenging that the ways in which we did things doesn't necessarily mean the ways that we need to go forward. And having these more nuanced conversations with each other, that there isn't one way to solve, you know, girls' education problems, and there's
Yeah.
not one type of group or individual that should or could be doing that. And I think there for me, I have to hold the belief that there's possibility of change, um, and that there are lots of ways in which that change is happening, and that we all have to also do the internal work. I think the past in a lot of the global development space was, let's go fix it over there.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think that that part of that is questioning your own self, your own core beliefs, and continuing to challenge some of the boxes that we still put things in
Yeah.
ourselves.
Yeah, definitely. Self reflection is very important. I agree with that. Okay, so on to our next question, another debate question.
Yeah.
How would you argue against someone who believes that mild domestic violence is necessary for a man to maintain order in his home? How would you argue against that?
Uh, Never.
Yeah,
Violence under any circumstances
yeah,
is not okay or accepted. Um, and again, when we if it's framed in for a man to keep
yeah,
order or control, again, that's getting at these ideas, these entrenched belief structures around masculinity, around patriarchy, around control. And that to me gets down to, again, around the important work of understanding and seeing gender norms,
mhm,
what we have taught men. We also know, right, perpetrators of violence, and particularly gender-based violence, right? A lot of it is also, too, the ways in which we've constructed masculinity. You're not a
mhm,
man if, in air
yeah,
quotes, you're not providing for your home. You're not a man if your wife is out in certain parts of public, right? You're not a
mhm,
man if, right? And I think a lot of the times we work to support the change on the women's empowerment, all of these things, which are really, really important, and are also leaving out the other side of it, which is, you know, can be described kind of that toxic masculinity, that,
mhm,
right? Also increasing the size of the man box that's been talked about,
mhm,
the Gary Barton work, right? Around what does it mean to be a man and what are those opportunities, right? We know that men don't seek mental health services, all the bias around, you know, seeking services, but also when you're breaking that norm, if you're the man in the community that potentially isn't doing these things in the home, how are you also changing those societal norms or expectations, or having different conversations about what it also means to be a man?
Yeah.
Because those are huge influencers for a lot of why a lot of these things happen.
Yeah. So how would you go about, like, if you were teaching someone to be a man, how would you change the societal norms that produce negative results, like things like domestic violence and things like that?
Well, I'm trying to raise two men within my home or
Yeah.
identify. And a lot of it is just helping, again, I should say just on my personal level, like with my two sons, is having these conversations, right? Questioning our own language. I'll give you a good example. I had a conversation, a healthy debate, I'd like to call it healthy, with my father yesterday, who had my middle son out. They were fishing or something, and he did something, and my dad kept saying to him, "You need to man up. You need to
Mm,
man up. Why are you
mm,
crying? What you need to man up." And my son came home and was really upset. Like why was he called him Papa? Why was Papa telling me to man up? What does that mean? Why can't I cry? And I had to sit down with my 76-year-old dad and say, "Dad, that is a gender norm and an
yeah.
expectation you are passing down to my son. It's
Mm,
okay if he cries. It's
yeah.
actually wonderful.
Mm,
And what do you even mean by man up? And what does that even mean? What was he
yeah.
supposed to have done that would have, and it allowed for me to have a conversation with my father, and my father to be able to examine something to him that was just like, oh, it's a phrase. I didn't mean anything by it, but be able to unpack that for him of like,
Yeah.
think about the subliminal messaging you're telling him, that he can't be vulnerable, that he can't cry, that he can't express outside of what you're saying it means for him to be a boy in this society.
Mm,
Like the implications for that is depression, we know, drug
yeah.
use,
Yeah.
all of these things. And so I think, it's those micro conversations, it's the making it visible. It's allowing for someone like my father, who's 76 years old, to have a different conversation, have a different understanding, right? Him and my son will now have different interactions. Like, and
Yeah.
that's the way that I think the world changes ultimately. We do the work ourselves, and we have spheres of influence on this field. I call it the micro to macro moments, right?
Mm,
It's this
yeah.
micro moment that has potentially macro implications if you're able to think about the ripple effects of
Mm,
conversations like that. And you think about conversations like that happening all over the place, whether at a barber shop, whether at schools, of different ways of being, and an acceptance around that allows for change, I think, change to really happen.
yeah. And so, do you think those debates over the or those conversations through the tough topics like this, do you think those are necessary?
Oh, critical.
Yeah. And so,
I
would
don't
you
think we're
say?
having the right conversations. I don't
Yeah.
think we're actually getting at the heart of the issue.
And so, would you say that is it more important when people are closer to you, more important than people you don't know, or is it equally important?
I think it's equally important. And I
Okay.
think in the US, in our current political environment, we shut down.
Mm, yeah.
And we avoid
Yeah.
really hard stuff is happening in this world, really challenging things, right? That
Yeah.
have, like I said, this like more micro implications for nuclear families, for friendships. They're also tearing apart our society at the heart, at the highest levels. But those, like I always say, like people talk about systems change as this huge thing, policy change is this huge
Yeah.
thing. And it is in a way, but systems are made up of people, of
Yeah.
individuals
Mhm.
who come to the table with their own bias, their own ways of thinking about things, right? So, in
Yeah.
order to change systems, you need to change individuals because those are the individuals that are creating policies at work, that are then going out and creating policies, whether that's in local government and school districts, right? And so it does take those hard conversations, and also takes being able to have conversations across the aisle, that of
That's right.
someone that doesn't have your same perspective. Like I was saying, like I don't even know how to debate somebody that says that a certain form of violence is okay to hold people
Yeah.
in their place, right? But there's a really important conversation of, why do you believe that?
Yeah.
What power are you holding on or holding over somebody? What are you missing? What do you need in order to release that power over somebody, another human? there's more nuanced conversations there that aren't necessarily, we become so, black and white on issues. And there's this really interesting gray where in the end of the day, I think we have way more in common about what we want our world to look like, not to be the environment to blow up in the next 20 years. And all
Yeah.
of these, at the end of the day, we want to be accepted. We want to be valued. We want to be a part of something bigger, and we want to contribute.
Yeah.
As far as we know, we got one go at it, right?
Yeah.
So I do think that it's going to take more of that connection and that understanding and listening and
Yeah.
being curious instead of going right into what you believe. Why do you believe that? What do it's that curiosity that I think we've lost, and that ability to have those conversations that we're too far on one side or the other, and we're just like yelling across the Grand Canyon.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no bridge building happening.
Definitely. That's a great analogy right there. And so the reason why I do agree with you that it's important to have those conversations. And the reasons why I would ask is that some would say that they avoid those conversations and like in an attempt to preserve their relationship with people. Would you
Mm,
say that it's necessary to have those conversations even at the risk of your relationship with people, and why? What are the benefits of it? What are the takeaways? What are the negatives?
mm. I mean, I respect, and I would say a big proportion of my life was not saying things at the expense of my own expense,
Yeah.
quite frankly. And what I've found is to be intentional and deliberate. Like my old self would be like, this is the way I feel, and this is why, and like just again, stay entrenched in my own beliefs and just shout it across. And now what I've realized is I need to start building those steps to the other side. And that
Mhm.
first step doesn't have to be massive. If I could use the example of my father, but the old me would have just either avoided it, told my son, it's okay. That's a really old gender norm.
Yeah.
Your grandpa's old. He loves you. That's not what he meant, right? And you deal with it. And the person I'm learning to be is taking those steps to sit down with my dad and start with someone gave me this incredible framework, which I use all the time now, which is differentiating intent versus impact.
Mhm.
So I could say to my father, I know your intent was great. Your intent was to support him and to make him feel better and try to help the situation where you thought he was upset. The
Mhm.
impact was this. So how, and so we could have a conversation without blame, without accusation, without anger. And we got a little closer.
Yeah.
There's still a divide on that canyon, but we've got a few steps where we're not just shouting and staying on our sides. We're starting to come to the middle, and it'll take many attempts and continuing to grow that. But the beauty of those conversations are that once you open them, and if you lead with curiosity, if you lead with wanting to understand, if you can let go of winning, which is very
Yeah.
hard for me. I'm probably one of the most competitive people I
Yeah.
know, but like if let go of that, whatever that is, um, the beauty in those relationships, I would argue, even though it's hard, actually deepens and expands
Mhm.
because you've been able to open an area that you just have been avoiding. So instead of the box staying the same size as you adhering by those rules in that relationship, it gets a little bigger, and there's
Yeah.
more things to explore and more things to potentially even open your own mind to different ways of seeing things.
Definitely. That's a great piece of advice. Thank you. All right. On to our last question for this episode.
Mm.
How would you help young women get more access to education in areas where, women's education isn't as prioritized as, say, the US or in lots of Eastern Europe?
How would I help? Like
Yeah.
if I had that magic billionaire wand,
Um,
or what?
I would say, how would you help them get more access in a way that somebody else in society could see it and mimic it, like something that another person could do?
Mm, I think I would approach it as I liked the way that you just framed it of how would we help somebody see that it's even an issue.
Mhm.
So I think that, I think there's lots of opportunity to use storytelling and to tell stories in ways to help people understand issues. That's more of like it's easy to turn off. Like that's not my issue.
Mhm.
That's not my issue, not my country, not my children, not my daughters, not my
Yeah.
of just the global importance. And I'll give you an example of this because this really the data around this is actually pretty incredible. We're putting tons and tons of money into climate mitigation, into really trying to figure out the current climate disaster that we find ourselves in right now, right? Tons of money. When you look at the research, actually, gender equality, particularly girls' education, is a huge climate mitigator.
Okay.
Girls going to school, girls having the ability to choose when and if they have a family, how many children they have, right?
Yeah.
Whether or not they are able to get a job, buy a plot of land, take care of that land. All of these things are huge climate mitigators. And what we've done in society is to silo all of these things. And I think that taking an issue like girls' education that has huge implications for other things is a really important story to tell. Yes, as a individual right, every human has the right to an education and to better themselves and to live a full life. And also those investments are intertwined with climate, with health outcomes, with all vaccination rates. It's not as siloed as we've cut these issues up. They're really integrated. And I think that particularly girls' education is one that if you're investing, you want to see climate mitigation happen, you should be investing in girls' education. You want to see vaccination rates go up, invest in girls' education.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think it's telling a more holistic story that everybody has a role to play in it. It matters for all of us. It matters for our planet. It matters for us being collectively better humans. I think that that's the way that I would spend my resources and my time is that kind of storytelling and connecting so that everybody understands that this isn't a one single issue. It's an issue that could catalyze and, massively accelerate the things that we all care about, as well as doing right by girls.
That's great. That's a really important perspective you just shared. Thank you. So that is it for the Perspective podcast today. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate all the wisdom and perspective that you shared today. Yeah, so thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It was fun.